The third session of the 2023 Ohio State University Extension Beef Team's Virtual Beef School was broadcast via Zoom on March the 8th. The first portion of the evening's program focused on emerging concerns for the tick populations in Ohio, and more specifically the Asian Longhorn tick, and concerns for Theileria that it can cause beef cattle and other animals to contract. Here, Garth Ruff introduces Dr. Risa Pesapane and her presentation on the subject.
I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pesapane to talk about ticks and a little bit on Theileria.
Thank you everyone for having me. So we're going to talk primarily about Asian Longhorn ticks and Theileria tonight. But we're also going to cover generally what's been happening with ticks. So why are we talking about ticks in Ohio? Well, you've all probably encountered ticks over time, but the diversity and abundance of ticks has really dramatically increased in Ohio in recent years. And that's because Ohio is at the epicenter of tick range expansion for several medically important tick species. And to be clear, this trend of increasing ticks and tick-borne diseases is happening throughout much of the US, but actually no other region is really experiencing this at such a great scale or at this diversity of tick invasion like the Ohio River Valley area of the United States. So the maps that you're seeing now represent a rough approximation of the general distribution of these medically important ticks. And so on the left, we started with the American dog tick, which has kind of always been here in Ohio, and the brown dog tick, which we also call these kennel ticks because they're typically found anywhere that dogs and humans are. They like dog kennels and they're and adjacent human structures. So you're not likely to encounter them out in nature, but they have always been reported in Ohio. But then we started seeing a change in our community. So the black-legged ticks started invading, and then the Lone Star ticks arrived. So black-legged ticks were kind of being sandwiched from the endemic ranges of this tick up in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. And then Lone Star ticks have been steadily spreading northward in the United States. We now have Gulf Coast ticks as well, which are currently, we have documented them in southwestern Ohio in several counties. And then as of 2020, we did get the Asian Longhorn tick, which is an exotic tick. We're going to talk a lot about this tick today. So essentially, we went from two medically important ticks, one of which you're likely to encounter out and about in nature or outdoors. And now we have 6 medically important tick species in the state. And this happened really just in a period of less than 20 years. And even though we're here to talk about the threat to livestock today, I want to be very clear that you, your companion animals, and your livestock are all at risk from each of these tick species. So this is a big table of all the human and animal diseases that have been or can be associated with these different species. And to highlight just a few that I wanted to talk about, it's our American dog ticks that can cause bovine anaplasmosis, which you're going to hear more about in Dr. Kiefer's talk. The black-legged tick, of course, can transmit the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, which affects people and dogs. And importantly, since this tick arrived in Ohio, we've had an increase, or a tenfold increase, I should say, in our Lyme disease cases in the past 10 years alone as this tick has spread across Ohio. We have the Lone Star tick, which is associated with the development of an allergy called alpha-gal syndrome, or you might have heard of it as the red meat allergy or mammalian meat allergy, which basically means people can no longer eat any mammalian meat like beef, pork, lamb, even products that are made with these mammalian meat proteins can cause this reaction, and it can be quite severe. Of course, we're going to talk more about the Asian Longhorn tick, which can transmit a blood parasite called Theileria, and it also causes severe anemia purely just from feeding. And the Gulf Coast tick, actually in our livestock, can cause a problem where the ears become swollen and deformed or curled and drooped. sometimes even necrotic. And this is purely just from the damage done by the tick as it's feeding with its really large mouth parts. So that we refer to that sometimes as gotch ear. And if you're not familiar with what that looks like, here's one example. So there certainly are quite a number of things to be concerned about with ticks, and this is important for your entire, ecosystem of your property, all of the animals and people living on it. So now I'm hoping I've convinced you that these ticks can pose a threat, and all of the ones that occur here in Ohio can be concerning. So I wanted to kind of cover some common misconceptions about basic tick biology, just so that we're all on the same page when we talk about the how, what, where, and why of Asian Longhorn ticks affecting your cattle in just a little bit. So we're going to play a game of tick fact or fiction. So first of all, do ticks fall from trees? Well, this is fiction. Ticks do not fall from trees. They do not fly. They do not jump. They only climb up low-lying vegetation and do something called questing, which is with their front limbs out, feeling and sensing for hosts coming by. So at most, they might be at the highest, maybe hip height. Okay. A lot of people may think that they fall from trees because they end up, moving upwards on your body, and you might find them in your hairline and things, but that's because they've crawled up your body, not because they fell from a height. So tick fact or fiction, do ticks die off in winter? Nope, that is also fiction. Ticks overwinter. They often become dormant. They find places to hide in leaf litter or in the soil. And so, for example, this is a snowy trail, and there were ticks collected on this trail the day that someone went looking. So some tick species will be dormant in winter, and you would not be able to find them or collect them at all, even though they're there and alive. But other tick species, like the black-legged tick, will be active even in winter, so long as the temps are above about 40 degrees. Fact or fiction, only adult ticks blood feed. This is also fiction. A lot of people are unaware, actually, that all of the life stages of hard ticks, which is this group of ticks we're talking about now, but the larvae, the nymph, and the adult, they all feed on blood. So it's not just the adults, it's not just the nymphs. Even the little baby ticks are going to take a blood meal, and they typically take one per life stage. So just to recap what the tick life cycle looks like, they are really hardy parasites. They live for long periods of time in the environment, even without feeding. And the typical life cycle takes about 2 years to complete. The graphic that I've shown here is specific to the black-legged tick, but the Asian Longhorn tick life cycle is quite similar. And so let's see if I can use my pointer. Laser pointer. Okay, so if we're starting at the center of our graphic here, in our first year, eggs are laid in the spring and they hatch in the summer, and these larvae are going to go out looking for that very first meal, and they might bite a wide variety of wildlife, sometimes even people. And once they take that meal, they're then going to rest and molt into the next life stage, which is a nymph. And so in our second year, that nymph is then going to go out looking for its next blood meal, at which point it may have become infected with a pathogen from feeding on those hosts as a larvae. And so now it could potentially infect a new host with that pathogen, or pick up a pathogen this time if it wasn't already infected. And again, it will then rest and molt and emerge as an adult in this second year. And now it's had 2 opportunities to become infected. It's more likely to bite a slightly larger host this time, including people or deer. And once the female takes that blood meal, she's going to focus on laying eggs, and she will lay those eggs and die. the males will mate and die, and that completes this 2-year life cycle. So all the ticks we're discussing today have these 4 life stages: egg, larvae, sometimes I call them baby ticks, nymphs, or sometimes called teenage ticks, and these adult ticks. And they are only going to typically feed once per life stage. So they're only taking essentially 3 meals in their whole lives. But they do need to feed for at least 3 to 7 days. So you can imagine, given that this is a very important meal for each life stage, that they would be very, very good at hanging on and being discreet about being detected. So they have a variety of compounds in their saliva that act to prevent inflammation, prevent itching, and prevent detection so that you don't notice they're there. Okay, fact or fiction: ticks only bite in the spring or summer. This is also fiction. So as I mentioned, some ticks are active anytime the temperatures are above freezing. And so people and animals can get tick-borne disease all year. This is a chart from the Ohio Department of Health that shows when we typically see submissions or collections of the black-legged tick. These are different life stages. So you can see that we have adult male and female ticks active right now. And soon we're about to see these nymphal tick stages coming out. And then all those larvae are going to hatch, and we'll have this big peak of larvae. And then again, we see the adults come out in fall. And this is typically when they're going to get on white-tailed deer. And so really there is very few months of the year on the calendar that you don't have a risk of bite from a black-legged tick. Certainly though, the warmer months of the year are when most ticks are more active, and so your risk is higher then, but it's certainly non-zero the rest of the year. Okay, fact or fiction: you can smother a tick so it releases its bite. This is definitely fiction, and it's a myth that just does not die. None of these products, like you might have heard, Vaseline, nail polish, matches, gasoline, none of these things help. And that's because ticks have this substance they release called cementum. It's literally named for the fact that it cements that tick in place. So they cannot voluntarily release their bite. They have to secrete an enzyme that dissolves that cementum in order to drop off. So none of these remedies here are going to help remove the tick. They're just going to delay that removal. And some studies have shown that using them will actually increase the risk of tick-borne disease because of that delay. Okay, so let's now get to the meat of what I wanted to share with y'all today. And that is what we currently know about the Asian longhorn tick. Its scientific name is Haemaphysalis longicornis. It's a mouthful. So what I wanted to go over today was where they come from, how are they spreading, where they currently are in Ohio as far as we know, what are the risks that we know from this tick, and importantly for all of y'all is, how are you going to detect this tick if it's on your property? How can you prevent this tick from ending up on your property? And if you do find them, how can you manage them? And if you think you have them, what should you do? Okay. So where did they come from? Well, this tick is relatively globally distributed. It is originally thought to be from Japan, but it's spread to Australia and New Zealand in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We think because of the livestock trade, and it has spread all over the world in many places since then because of that. So honestly, we're pretty lucky we did not get it until now. It's pretty impressive. But in the United States over here, we did first confirm that these ticks were in the US in 2017. They found them swarming sheep on a farm. So although they had been detected like in USDA quarantine facilities where they are inspecting livestock, they had never documented this tick in the natural environment in the US until 2017. But when they discovered it was here, they started looking at kind of archival records of ticks, and it can be, this tick can be easily misidentified as one of our native ticks. And so they did find that there was record of this tick species in the United States, in West Virginia, I believe it was, on deer, going as far back as 2010. So probably this tick actually got to the United States sometime around 2010. And it's not clear exactly what animal or possibly even person introduced it. We'll probably never know, but certainly this is a product of global trade and travel, which is of course increasing, or the pace of that is increasing. We can move people and animals around the world in a very short period of time within the time frame of a tick feeding on a host, so that when it drops off, it has an opportunity to colonize a new place. So this tick is now found in 17 states. This is the current USDA situation report. They update it every single month. And as I mentioned, it started in the New Jersey area, and it's kind of been steadily moving or being detected down the Appalachian corridor. The reason this tick is such a good colonizer is because unlike any other tick that is present in the United States, these female ticks can reproduce asexually. So that means they do not have to find a male to mate. Each female is going to lay 1,000 to 2,000 ish eggs, and all of those will be female, and all of them will lay 2,000 eggs, and all of those will be female, and all of them will lay 2,000 eggs. So you can see that we can very, very quickly establish a local population. So it only takes one Asian Longhorn tick to find a suitable site, and it can establish a whole local population. So if you see even one Asian Longhorn tick, you should assume that they could be established in the area. And so far, this tick has been tasting the buffet of hosts available in the United States. It's been reported on more than 26 different species and counting. It really, really likes cattle, obviously, or livestock, sheep, in general. But additionally, it loves deer. It's also reported often on canids, like primarily domestic dog, but also very often on fox and coyote. It's found in relatively high burdens on possum, raccoons. And very recently, we've now discovered that this tick is parasitizing migratory birds, which is quite concerning because that could, of course, aid in very long distance dispersal. And it is willing to bite people. It seems slightly less interested in doing so, but plenty of human biting reports exist. So in general, what we're seeing is, again, ticks cannot fly, they don't drift in the wind, they don't jump, they don't move very far on their own. So they're really dispersed by animal hosts. And so probably kind of local diffusion of this tick in the local area is happening from wildlife. And then likely the movement of domestic animals farther distances, like when we travel with our dogs or cattle and things, could be depositing them further distances, as will migratory birds. So where are they currently in Ohio? So we know of them existing in at least 7 counties. So the first county we found a tick, the Asian Longhorn tick, was in Gallia in 2020. Then we also found them in Jackson, Monroe, and we've recently added Guernsey, Franklin, Belmont, and Morgan counties. And we know this is probably really underreported. There's probably more counties where this tick exists, particularly all along the Ohio River. We know that pretty much all of the counties along the border of West Virginia and Ohio are infested with this tick, or this tick's been reported in them. Similarly, at the southern edge near Kentucky, So we know that, and we fully expect that this tick is in many more counties than these 7, but it is clearly progressing. With each year, we're discovering more of them since 2020. So I would expect this to accelerate fairly quickly in the coming years. So what are the risks from Asian Longhorn tick? So the picture on this top left here is me performing a tick drag, which is where we drag a light colored cloth over vegetation and we stop and examine for ticks. And in this case, there were so many ticks on the drag that I actually had to use a lint roller. So I hope everyone will take a minute and look closely at that lint roller, and you can see actually every one of those little specks is a baby Asian Longhorn tick. Those are all larvae. We collected more than 8,000 individual ticks in about 90 minutes in this infested pasture. And this was even after it was mowed and there was no cattle on the pasture for more than a month. So what we see, first of all, with this tick as a risk is it forms these massive infestations on properties. And that's owing to the fact that it can reproduce asexually, as I mentioned. So that means there are swarms in the thousands of very, very hungry ticks that are looking for hosts. This tick will or has been reported on pretty much every kind of habitat, even on concrete in heavily infested areas. They can be found crawling, but generally it really likes prairie, pasture, meadow, these kinds of open habitats, especially where they adjoin with forest edge. And all of our heavily infested properties in Ohio are unmowed pastures. So those are especially risky because the high grass allows them protection from water loss and too much sun. And so that seems to be a high risk situation for this tick. So if you have the introduction of an Asian Longhorn tick to these unmowed pastures, there's a good chance it's going to thrive and do very, very well there. We have done a whole year of surveillance at this study site where I collected, and we found the ticks to become active the last week of May or first week of June, and they were active on that property all the way through November. So we were able to collect different life stages of Asian Longhorn tick every month from June to November at this property. That's quite a chunk of the calendar year to be concerned about these many thousands of ticks potentially feeding on you and your animals. So, as I mentioned, this tick, because it's feeding in these large numbers, they can cause severe anemia, so much so that the animals can even die from excessive blood loss, which is called exsanguination. And actually, calves are typically at the highest risk of exsanguination. You know, they're small body size, but we were alerted to this infestation in my previous slide because an Ohio producer actually lost several heifers and a young 5-year-old, like really healthy bull just from the number of ticks that were feeding on them. And this happened very quickly. So even if your cattle do not die from infestation, they certainly would be stressed from all of this parasitism, and you might see impacts to their growth and, of course, production, like, for example, dairy. So it's certainly bad news just in the sheer numbers of ticks. So this is one photo. All of those little brown dots here within the hair of the cow are all ticks, various life stages and stages of engorgement during their feeding. And of course, this tick also can transmit certain diseases or certain pathogens that cause disease. And the one that we are most concerned about is called bovine tylerosis, or for the sake of today's talk, I might refer to it as BT. But importantly, there always have, or for a long time have been some genotypes or strains of this organism, Theileria orientalis, that have been present in the United States that do not cause illness in cattle. But the type that was introduced with this tick is called Akita type. And this is very concerning because it does cause pretty severe pathology in cattle. So it is a blood parasite, and it causes anemia, jaundice, weakness, and it's very often or very easily confused with bovine anaplasmosis. And so, you know, as a producer, if you're initially kind of concerned, like, do I have BT or BA? Sometimes you can make an assessment based on the fact that cattle with bovine tyleriosis are typically less aggressive than those with anaplasmosis. And of course, bovine tyleriosis does affect calves, whereas anaplasmosis is less likely to cause severe illness in calves. It's more problematic for older cattle. But of course, you should definitely talk to your veterinarian if you have any kind of symptoms that resemble what could be BT or BA, because there are actually tests now here in Ohio. So the Ohio Department of Agriculture's Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory does have a PCR test, and PCR is the gold standard test, and it's able to differentiate bovine anaplasmosis from bovine tyleriosis, and it will look specifically for this particularly nasty strain of the Akita type of Theileria. I just also, before we move on from this, want to mention that most of the time, BT is transmitted by ticks, tick bite, but it can be directly transmitted via things like needles, similar to the way BA can also be transmitted that way. So what does it look like, again, with bovine tyleriosis? Usually you're going to see cattle that have fever, lethargy, they're going to be weak, not interested in moving, they're going to be anemic, they're going to have jaundice, they kind of look unthrifty, have low weight gain, and we do sometimes see late-term abortions. The incubation period of BT is about 8 to 48 days, but typically, on average, what we're seeing is about 3 weeks after cattle are introduced to a pasture infested with BT infected ticks, we see cases about 3 weeks later. So that's about the onset time. And bovine tyleriosis in and of itself can reduce production and cause death from that severe anemia. And typically we're seeing herd mortality between 1% and 5%. And of course, this is especially problematic in calves. I will say it has been reported higher, and we'll talk about individuals that are especially susceptible. But it does cause major economic losses. There's very few estimates here in the US. Internationally, it's known to be hugely problematic. So there are some estimates that it can cost anywhere between $400 and $700 per infected cow in expenses or losses. And importantly, we currently have no approved effective treatment or vaccine for Theileria orientalis in the United States. So we really need to focus on prevention and biosecurity. So most of our clinical BT cases are going to occur in spring and fall, but they do sometimes happen year-round. And as I mentioned, some animals are especially susceptible to severe disease. So that would be our pregnant heifers and calves. We also see, in general, any animal that is totally naive to any Theileria species. So, for example, I mentioned there was this native strain of Theileria orientalis in the US that does not cause illness. If they've never been exposed to any Theileria, then they will likely have a much higher or a much more severe reaction to this nasty genotype, Akita type BT, when they become infected. But not all cattle become symptomatic. So some infected cattle, like when they do whole herd testing, they find that there are many more animals who are positive than are actually showing clinical signs. And so there are individuals who are asymptomatic, but all of the infected cattle can be carriers and then serve as a source of infection to infect more ticks on the property and subsequently other cattle on the property. And importantly, those individuals can relapse even if they are currently doing well because they remain chronically affected. So that is not great. It requires long-term management, of course. And I wanted to share that it's pretty impressive that so once a cow is infected, they have sufficient levels of this parasite in their blood to then infect these ticks on the property after just 10 days. So you can imagine that, you know, if you only had a few ticks or a few infected ticks, the tick population is booming, cows are getting infected, and then all of those thousands of ticks that are feeding off of those cows are then infected and can infect other cattle on your herd in those subsequent life stages. So we really have this very perfect storm to create a huge outbreak on a property. And even if you were to remove cattle, if the ticks remain on the property, they can live for very long periods of time without feeding. So you could have a remaining risk of infection in that pasture for 1 to 2 years even. So that is difficult. I did also want to mention sometimes there might be certain cattle breeds or age that can increase disease susceptibility. So we still don't have a ton of good data on that, but that is another consideration that some animals may fare better than others. So in Ohio, so far, we had our very first farm with a positive cow for bovine tyleriosis in Monroe County in 2022. And we do know, in the smaller map here on the bottom right, we do know that the Akita type has been detected in all of these states in red, and it is in many counties in West Virginia. So again, we fully expect to see lots more bovine tyleriosis in Ohio, and it probably is here in more Asian Longhorn ticks than we currently know. So that's why we're hoping to do more surveillance. And it's important that if you see anything that looks like BA or BT in your cattle, that you consult your veterinarian and consider doing testing to determine which pathogen you're actually dealing with. So what else can Asian Longhorn ticks transmit? Well, internationally, they have been associated with huge number or diversity of different pathogens. So far in the United States, we do not have any documented evidence of them actually transmitting or being associated with clinical cases of anything other than bovine tyleriosis. But we have done laboratory experiments and determined that they are potentially very good at transmitting the agent of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is a very severe tick-borne disease in people and pets. Internationally, they have been associated with bovine anaplasmosis, but to my knowledge, we have not found any Asian Longhorn ticks in the US in the field that have been positive for that, the organism that causes that. And the same is true with bovine babesiosis. In the laboratory, they have demonstrated that this tick could be good at transmitting Heartland virus and Bourbon virus, which can infect people. So we are concerned and constantly monitoring both what this tick is positive for in the field in terms of, what it's taking up from all of the animals it's feeding from in nature, but also performing laboratory experiments to then see if it's able to transmit that organism to subsequent hosts that it bites. So right now it's something that is rapidly evolving and we're watching very closely. So how would you know if you had Asian Longhorn ticks? Well, this is a graphic that shows the different life stages, and the little black dots you see are meant to be the actual size. So unfed larvae are really, really tiny. as are unfed nymphs. And when they feed, they can get quite large. So that's an engorged nymph and an engorged female. Again, you don't see a male pictured here because they don't need males to mate, and they typically have little to no males in the population at all when they clone themselves. So rather than expecting you to be able to identify this tick, you might have better luck looking for certain characteristics. So for example, this tick is relatively fast moving. So sometimes people say that their animals were covered in really tiny spider looking creatures. But the most indicative of Asian Longhorn tick presence on a property is just really unusually high numbers of ticks on animals. Or sometimes you can even see the clusters of these ticks questing on the tips of vegetation. It almost looks like seeds on the end of vegetation in pasture. So if you see large numbers of ticks, then that is potentially a good indication that you have Asian Longhorn tick. And again, just to reiterate how small these ticks can be, this is a picture of the nymph, not even the smallest baby tick, but the nymph, the teenage tick on someone's fingernail. So they are really teeny tiny. So when you should be looking for them to detect them, in Ohio at that site, as I mentioned, we see nymphs first, actually. So that's this graphic in yellow. That this chart comes from New Jersey, but our period of activity looks very similar to this. So nymphs in yellow, they're going to emerge, like I said, kind of late May, early June. We were able to collect them in that field. Then we see adults. So our largest tick size becomes active in the middle of the year, or middle of the summer, June and July. And then we have this big boom in all of those larvae that hatch. And that starts in August and really dominates through the fall into November. So an interesting observation we've had here in Ohio is that almost all of our detections of this tick or reports of this tick on cattle causing problems have been reported like plus or minus a week of Independence Day. So, you know, that last week of June, first week of July, that's when we start to see the population of nymphs and adults really peak, and people are seeing enough of them on their animals that they become alarmed. All right, so I wanted to show you a video about how you could also check your cattle for ticks.
Sounds not coming through.
Each year, ticks cost $275 million in loss to agriculture. With the recent introduction of the invasive Asian Longhorn tick, it is even more important to check animals for these blood-sucking pests. Checking ticks on cattle can help prevent some of these economic problems because tick bites cause irritation and blood loss, which decrease production. Additionally, a tick bite may also lead to transmission of a pathogen. To check your animals for ticks, first lead the animal into the chute and make sure it is secure in a head gate. This allows you to easily check it without hurting yourself or the animal. Start at the front of the animal by checking head, neck, and ears. Feel around the animal for bumps with the flat part of your hands. Constant touch is better for the animal and best for feeling a tick. Then work your way to the sides. It is difficult to look at the legs, but with caution and your animal's permission, you can safely feel around the legs of your animal. Finally, check the top of the tail as well as the underside, including around the anus. If a tick is found, remove it by grabbing as close to the skin as possible and pulling with even pressure. Place the tick in a tube or plastic bag with ethanol. Record the time and date of tick removal, breed and age of cow, and the GPS coordinates or the farm address. If problems arise, show the tick to a veterinarian or your local county extension agent. After checking, be sure to wash your hands.
Okay, so if you think you have Asian Longhorn tick on your property because you've been seeing large numbers of this tick, or because you've been scratching your cattle and you found ticks on that cow, or you have seen any kind of clinical signs that might suggest that you have this tick, or you have positive results that your cattle are infected with bovine tyleriosis. What we want you to do is contact either your veterinarian or your county extension agent first. It's great if you can collect a few ticks if possible. If not, perhaps your extension agent or veterinarian can help you with that process. You could also potentially contact the Division of Animal Health, and that's their phone number there, or you can email my lab. But all of these groups are connected. So typically your veterinarian should know to contact ODA or OSU. Your county extension agent, of course, that information would get to me and I would report it to ODA. So whichever route you go, this whole group of collaborators within Ohio will find out. And when you collect ticks, you know, they mentioned in the video, you can put them in a vial, you can put them in a bag. It's great if you have alcohol or ethanol on hand, but I've found that a lot of people don't. So even if you just put them in a Ziploc bag and plop them in the freezer, that will kill those ticks and preserve them so that we can examine them. So Ziploc and freezer is just fine. Okay, so preventing this tick, right? That's really the best approach. We know, as I mentioned, that really tall grass is ideal habitat for this tick. So if you can keep your pastures mowed, or at least the perimeter of pastures mowed where they have that interface with the woodland area, that is going to help prevent this tick from colonizing the pasture. And again, that's because when the grass is short, there's a lot more sunlight, and causes this process we call solarization in ticks. So they are at much higher risk of evaporative water loss, and that is a big problem for ticks. They work very hard to avoid evaporative water loss. You can also clear brush from feedlots and pastures, try to prevent access to wooded areas by your cattle. So if you can create like a 20-foot perimeter or barrier between pasture and woodland, that would be great. Really importantly, you're going to want to be checking, potentially treating, or at least quarantining any cattle that have moved off your property and come back, or if you're importing new cattle into your herd. So that's going to be really important. And since I mentioned this tick really likes to feed on dogs as well, you want to use preventives on your pets to make sure your pets are not serving to introduce this to your property either, particularly if those animals leave your property. So if you do find this tick, what should you do? How would you manage the problem? Again, right now, we know that mowing is a really good approach. There is some evidence that if you were able to combine mowing with a pesticide like spraying behind the mower, that will potentially, you know, mowing will expose the ticks that are there, then allow the pesticide to come in contact with those ticks and kill them, because these pesticides require direct contact. So if the grasses are tall, it's very hard to do that. But in general, we only recommend using pesticide on vegetation if your infestations are really severe. And that's in part because really single applications of pesticides are not really going to be super effective against this tick, because of the fact that it has to come in direct contact with them and the population is so large. What they found is that really the tick population can rebound within a month or so of having knocked them way back. And so it's probably better to treat, like I said, mow and then treat cattle via using ear tags, perhaps rubbing stations, or again, if you have a severe infestation on your cattle, you can use porons. Pyrethroids or permethrins are the best, but organophosphates are also effective. If you can engage in rotational grazing, that's probably also helpful. And again, the other reason we're concerned about chemical control is that being that this is a clonal tick, it's possible for these ticks to develop resistance rather quickly. So if you do use chemicals, you do not want to mix different classes of chemicals. You want to use the same class for 1 or 2 years in a row and then rotate, okay? So in general, it's very difficult to manage this tick once it's there, but if you can limit how severe your infestation is from the start. So let's say you detect this tick early, you keep things mowed, you keep ear tags and rubbing stations out for your cattle, you can really manage and keep the population from getting extreme on your property and having a much bigger problem. And of course, ideally, like I said, we want to be using a combination of these things. So like more like an integrated pest management plan that's managing hosts and vegetation and strategies like rotation. So I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone who's listening that people who are engaged in any kind of outdoor occupation are anywhere between 3 and 10 times more likely to get a tick-borne disease because they have such high exposure. And actually, we recently completed a survey among livestock producers in Ohio, and a majority of them said, indeed, they were exposed to ticks while working on the farm more often than they were doing anything else, like any leisure activities, things like that. So please remember that we're not only worried about preventing tick bites on your animals, but also preventing them on yourself. So that means performing routine tick checks when you come in from doing work out on your property. If you can, wear light colored clothes that cover exposed skin. Ideally, especially if you know there's ticks or it's a high risk time of year for ticks, you should be tucking pants into socks and shirts into pants. Or my favorite recommendation is actually to treat your clothes with permethrin. So you can buy permethrin from any big box store. It often comes in a big yellow bottle. One of the most available brands is Sawyer. And you can spray that on your clothes, and actually, once it dries, it is good for 6 weeks or multiple washings. And so that's great. You don't have to think about applying it every time. You can put it on your favorite coveralls or your jeans, whatever, your shoes, and that's going to really, really help a lot to prevent you from getting this tick. I stood in that pasture with those 8,000 ticks, and I had permethrin treated clothes on and did not get a single tick bite. So it really works. If you are unfortunately bitten by a tick, please do remove it as quick as possible. Again, not using any of those kind of folk remedies, and do save that tick in the baggie with the date in the freezer and have it identified to species, because as you saw in that chart, different ticks can transmit different pathogens. So the species can help your doctor kind of narrow down what you might be exposed to, since a lot of tick-borne diseases have similar symptoms when they present. So you're going to want to mark the date you were bitten on your calendar and monitor for kind of any signs of illness, any kind of flu-like symptoms for as long as 60 days. And then if you have any kind of symptoms or any concerns, you want to talk to your healthcare provider. And that is my time. So I would be happy to take any questions you might have about what I just shared.
I know one of the questions that come up at a field day last summer was, do the ticks persist in hay, Asian longhorn tick?
That's a great question. So, so like if you harvest your vegetation, yeah. So we're very interested in studying this because obviously mowing can be wasteful, and you'd rather save that that feed. And so no one has officially done a study on this. But in theory, the recommended dryness, like the storage conditions for haylage and baleage, is not conducive to the survival of this tick. So in theory, if you really are reaching those temperatures and that dryness level, moisture content that is recommended in haylage and baleage, in theory, the ticks, if there were any in that vegetation, would die. And there would not be a risk, except maybe at the margins where it's harder to control. those features, but they have not been empirically studied, so we can't say for sure, but it is a possibility that that's a route you could go.
Will the fermentation of silage or baleage, does that help kill the ticks? Getting that pH in the 4s and 5s?
That's a great question. So we my answer before was based on what we know about tick biology in terms of what kind of temperatures they can survive. And so no one has, or at least in literature, to my knowledge, no one has looked at what pH ticks need to survive. So I couldn't speak to whether or not that would impact them, but I would imagine that it would probably negatively impact those ticks. But again, that would be something we need to investigate. And we're hoping to get some studies conducted here through OSU to answer some of these questions.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. Certainly appreciate you logging on tonight, Risa, and sharing that with us.
Thank you for having me.